Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of chapter 25. This chapter is the most important chapter in the macro part of the book, or the course. The chapter isn't hard or difficult. Conceptually, it's a really straightforward chapter. I think as you listen to me talk through it and as you read the book, I think you'll find that it's really straightforward, really understandable, really logical. There's nothing technical in it. There's no um, math or complicated stuff. It's just really important though, because in this chapter, we're talking about the real fundamentals driving long run economic growth. I mean, in this chapter, what we're looking at is, differences across countries in terms of economic prosperity, in terms of standard of living, in terms of GDP per capita, income per capita, all those measures. We're looking at vast differences across the world, right? We see vast differences. We see that income per capita in the richest countries in the world is up $50,000, $60,000 per person. Income per capita, GDP per capita of $50,000 or $60,000 per person. If you look at the poorest countries in the world, somewhere like Haiti or Zimbabwe, those figures are like $1,000 per person. You can go on the internet and look at a list of kind of GDP per capita across the world, and it's very fascinating. I'd encourage you to do that. I'd probably do it in class if we were in an in-person class, but just Google it. It's really easy to find, and it's really interesting. But vast differences. And if you look across time, there's vast differences as well, right? Today, we're much richer than we were in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So in this chapter, we're talking about why do those differences exist? Why is it the case that some countries are rich and some countries are poor? This is the biggest question that we have in macroeconomics. This is the most important question that you can possibly think of in economics, I think, to the large extent. Remember where we are. We are finished now with the chapters on the data of macroeconomics. And so now in chapter 25, we're getting into the real meat and potatoes. We're getting into what's really important, what drives economic prosperity in the long run. And that's what this chapter is about. That's why this chapter is most important. And everything that we do from here on out refers back to this chapter. Everything we do in the book where we're talking about long run prosperity and macroeconomics, and even to a large extent, the short run stabilization part of the macroeconomic course still refers back to this chapter. So you have to really, really fully understand this chapter. Let's go to screen share. I have a little PowerPoint presentation, and I'll just walk us through. Again, GDP per capita in the richest countries in the world is more than 50 times that of the poorest countries. Just think about that. More than 50 times, richest countries are more than 50 times as rich as the poorest countries. Now, these photos are copied from the book, and they're really cheesy. But the thing is, we're talking about, numbers, and we're using numbers to kind of give you an idea of how much this stuff varies across the world. And sometimes a picture's worth 1,000 words or whatever, that old saying. And here we're just trying to kind of take the numbers and kind of show you what they look like in the real world in terms of pictures. All these graphs are out of date, by the way. So if you look at GDP per capita on this figure, it's out of date. Let's say it's 56,000 rather than 36,000, because these figures have gotten out of date. But anyway, so this is an example of a rich country. All right, this is one of the richest countries in the world, the United Kingdom. There we're talking about GDP per capita of around 50,000. And other measures that kind of capture quality of life also correspond with that. Life expectancy, 80 years, adult literacy, 99%. And you see what the house, you see what the family's, situation looks like. They have a pretty nice house, they have nice clothes, they have a car, they have a sailboat, for goodness sakes, they have a washer and dryer, they have an ironing board, they have a flute. And also notice only 2 kids. There's just 2 kids there as well. Anyway, it looks like a pretty nice family. It looks like they're doing pretty well. They're pretty wealthy. Now, this is an example of a middle income country, Mexico. This says GDP per capita of 14,000. Bump that up a little bit now, considering this is out of date. But Mexico is a little bit above the world average. Last time I checked, they were just a little bit above the world average. So they're a good example of a middle income country, or maybe even on the higher end of middle income. But here, this Mexican family, I mean, they don't look to be as rich as the family in the UK, but they look to be doing pretty well. I would look at that family and I'd be like, oh, they look like they're happy. They've got stuff. They're not living in poverty, not by any stretch of the imagination. Notice, however, they've got, a bunch more kids. They've got 4 kids. Notice life expectancy there is lower, 76 compared to 80 in the UK. And adult literacy is a lot lower. It's 86% versus 99%. So middle income country, definitely lower than the UK family, but still looks to be doing pretty well. Now here we have an example of one of the poorest countries in the world. This is Mali. If you don't know where Mali is, Google it, of course, but it's northwestern part of Africa. Mali's down there at GDP per capita of $1,000 or $2,000 per person, right? I mean, it's down there, 1/50th, or at the very least 1/25th, as wealthy as a country like the US or the UK. Now, this family is clearly in an entirely different situation. Their house is not much to speak of. A house like that in America would be, you can basically consider the person homeless if they lived in a house like that. They have a bunch of kids. Notice that's important to notice the number of kids. Life expectancy is way down there, 52 years. It was 80 in the UK, 52 years. In Mali, adult literacy less than 50%. Notice that, adult literacy less than 50%. Incredible. But again, those pictures are just to kind of put faces to those numbers. We're always talking about the numbers, but sometimes it is important to step back and just kind of look at the pictures as well. This figure shows you growth in GDP per capita across the world. And this is just making the point that growth rates vary as well. Just the level for GDP per capita varies dramatically across the world, which is what we were just talking about. But the growth rate, how quickly in countries are improving, that varies dramatically as well too. And even just a small difference in an economic growth rate can make a big, even just a 0.5 percentage point difference, 1.5% growth versus 2% growth. That kind of difference can make a huge difference when we're talking about the figure accumulating over the course of decades. So lots of variation in a cross-sectional sense, and lots of variation in a time series sense when we look back in time. So here's the issue. The answer to this question, why are some countries rich, why are some countries poor? It all depends on productivity. Productivity is defined as the output in the country by the typical worker in an hour. How much is the typical worker able to produce in 1 hour? That's what productivity is, and that is what determines standards of living. That is what determines GDP per capita. That's what determines all these things that we've been talking about. Productivity. Rich countries are rich because they have an economic system in place that allows the typical worker to produce a lot in an hour. Poor countries are poor because they don't have a system in place that allows the typical worker to produce a lot in an hour. I know that's an obvious point, that's a straightforward point, but it's important just to keep this in mind, because when we start talking about economic development, there's so many things out there and it can become so complicated and so convoluted. It's important to remember the fundamentals. And this is something that we should always keep in mind. Anyway, to go further, productivity is determined by these 4 economic fundamentals. Physical capital, that just refers to the machinery, the equipment, the facilities that workers use to produce goods and services. Any kind of factory building, any building where a business is located, the school building, right? If we were in an in-person class, the school building itself would be physical capital. That's a facility that we use to produce, in this case, an educational service. All the machinery, all the equipment that we use, the fact that we're using our computers and our iPads and that we're on Zoom right now, that's part of our physical capital. Human capital is just the education, the training, the knowledge of workers in the economy. It's the knowledge and the job skills of workers in the economy that they acquire through education and training. I mean, the whole reason you're in the MBA program is to enhance your human capital. It's not surprising that, one reason rich countries are rich is because they have high literacy rates. They have high rates of, number of people who finished high school, the number of people who finished college. Poor countries are poor because they don't have people who have acquired lots of education and job skills. Their workers aren't able to be as productive because of that lack of education. We just showed a second ago. In Britain, adult literacy, 99%. In Mali, less than 50%. I mean, how could you expect the typical worker in Mali to be very, very productive if less than half of them can read? I mean, that's pretty obvious, but it's still important to step back and remember that. I'm gonna go back to physical capital for a minute. One example that I like to use is farming. I lived in Nebraska for 8 years, and I lived in a city in Omaha. It's a mid-sized city, but I was still aware of the rest of the state. But in Nebraska, on the big farms out there, they have these absolutely gigantic pieces of farm equipment, that's so big that you can't fit it into a kind of like a typical classroom or whatever. And the capital, right, those pieces of equipment, that machinery, that physical capital they had in place in Nebraska was so big that one farmer could tend to just acres and acres and acres of land. Unbelievable the size of those farms and how few people it took to manage those farms because of the equipment that they had. In contrast, look at a country like Mali. I've never been to Mali. I don't really know anything about Mali. But I would imagine that the farming equipment they have in Mali is far, far, far inferior to that. So again, it's no wonder one country's rich, one country's poor, because the physical capital is so different in terms of allowing the typical worker to be productive. Same applies to human capital as well. Anyway, to get back to where we were, technology is the third. Technology is just society's understanding of the best way to produce goods and services. Technology is the biggest driver of economic growth across time. And that's no shocker, right? Nobody's surprised to hear that. The reason we are so much richer now than we were 100 years ago is because technology has improved dramatically. 100 years ago versus 200 years ago, we were so much richer because at that point, technology had improved dramatically. Technology is the biggest driver of productivity growth over time, and physical capital and human capital are the biggest explanatory factors of why some countries are rich and some countries are poor today. Does that make sense? And then the last one is just their access to natural resources. That's also an important determinant of productivity. If we improve our access to natural resources, that helps boost their productivity as well. I mean, if you look at today versus 15 years ago, there is a dramatic difference in our ability to access natural gas, right? Natural gas is a lot cheaper now. It's essentially a lot more abundant because we can access so much more natural gas than we could 15 years ago. So that's an example of an improvement in our access to natural resources. And that's also something that drives productivity. So moving on. So the stuff that we just talked about, productivity and its four determinants, that's something you have to keep in mind the whole class. You've got to keep that in mind. It's so important. And so that's an important part of the chapter. But then what we're about to do is also a really important part of the chapter. So suppose, the way I like to think about this is, imagine you're the advisor to the leader of a poor country. Suppose you're the advisor to the president of Haiti. I use Haiti as the example because it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So imagine the president of Haiti comes in and says, hey, you're my economic advisor. What in the world should we do to help this economy grow? That's what the rest of this chapter is about. I mean, the chapter is big picture, of course. It's not going to give you a whole lot of detail, but the chapter is going to kind of give you stuff that can help guide your discussion with the president of Haiti, trying to help him understand what he needs to do to boost his economy and increase the prosperity of his people over the long run. So the first is promote policies that will enhance savings and investment domestically, right? We know that physical capital is an important driver of productivity. That's no surprise. I think anybody in the world can understand that. But we have to save, we have to invest in order to accumulate physical capital. Now, I will say the next chapter is going to be entirely about the financial system, which is what facilitates savings and investment activity. So we're going to talk about this a lot in the next chapter. The next chapter is a long chapter. It's a big chapter. We're going to have a lot of work to do in the next chapter, but it's a follow-up to this. But anyway, we have to find ways to encourage savings and investment in the economy, and we have to find ways to, and that will in turn allow for us to better accumulate physical capital. Now, we'll say that's tough though, because remember that GDP equation, Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. Essentially, if we save more, right, that's the investment component of GDP is what we're talking about here. We are, talking about producing goods and services that allow us to be more productive in the future. But doing that requires us to sacrifice current consumption, right? I mean, we only have so much productive capacity at any given point in time. So we're going to devote that productive capacity to either producing goods that help us today or to producing goods that help us in the future. If we're going to choose the latter, that requires us to sacrifice the former. So doing things to promote savings and investment isn't just a trivial matter. It requires us to sacrifice today, and that's not always easy, especially for a poor country. So none of these options are easy, by the way. All these options, come with their challenges. If they were easy, then every country would be rich and there would be no discussion. Now, in this context, I just want to take a little aside, and I just want to explain one thing to you. This is called the catch-up effect, CATCH-UP, the catch-up effect. It's the notion of how poor countries catch up with rich countries. And it's based on the principle of diminishing marginal returns, okay? It's based on that. So think about this. Think about if you're going to graph capital per worker, right? This is how much equipment. This is a measure of the quality and quantity of equipment and machinery and facilities that you have. Capital per worker on this axis and output per worker on this axis. And the function looks like this, diminishing marginal returns. As you start out down here, I mean, if you're in a really poor country that has no machinery and equipment and facilities, a really poor country just starting out, when that country starts to add capital, it gets a lot of bang for its buck, right? Big growth in output as that poor country starts to add capital. But as you get rich, as you add more and more capital, additional capital doesn't mean as much to you. Right? I mean, if we're on a farm, if we are out there doing this stuff by hand, I mean, for us to get one big tractor would make such a difference, right? It would make tremendous difference in how much we could produce. But imagine adding the third tractor or the fourth tractor or the fifth tractor. It's not going to make as much difference, right? The third, fourth, fifth tractor can still probably boost output, but it's not going to be like going from 0 to 1. This is the principle of diminishing marginal returns. Principle of diminishing marginal returns. We talked about that back in chapter 13. We were talking about it just from the perspective of an individual business. This principle of diminishing marginal returns is all over the place in economics. Anyway, that's going to give you this production function that looks like that. That's increasing at a decreasing rate. As you add your first unit of capital, you get a huge bang for your buck out of it. As you add your 10th unit of capital, you get gains, but not nearly as much as the gains that you got on that first unit of capital. So here's the idea. If you take a poor country right here, and if it adds a unit of capital, it's going to get a lot of economic growth as a result. Take a rich country over here, if you add a unit of capital, you're not going to get nearly as much additional growth. Here's the idea that all else the same, right? If you have the same economic system in every other regard, then a poor country that doesn't have as much physical capital is going to grow more rapidly than a rich country. Okay, that and that explains a lot. We've seen this happen a lot. Now, some poor countries aren't growing because they have a whole bunch of other problems. We're going to talk about other types of problems here in just a second. But some countries aren't growing for that reason. But all else the same, right? If you have everything else in order in your economic system, when you start growing, when you start adding capital, you can grow really rapidly, and then that growth will slow down over time. Now listen to this too. If you look at variation in economic growth rates across time, if you just go to the data and look at, okay, how rapidly did this country grow over this 10-year period? How rapidly did that country grow over that 10-year period, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You can explain so much with this principle of diminishing marginal returns and the catch-up effect. The perfect example is Japan. You know, going into World War II, Japan was a rich country, right? If you go back to, you know, the 1930s, you know, Japan was a strong country, a powerful country. It had a productive economy. That's why it was able to conquer a huge, vast part of the globe. You know, obviously you can't do that unless you have a strong and productive economy. So Japan was in good shape as far as its fundamental systems go. Its workers were well educated, well trained, you know, at the time, right? We're talking about in comparison to the rest of the world in the 1930s. But it had a strong economy. But over the course of World War II, what happened to the capital stock in Japan, right? Japan was up here to begin with. It had a lot of capital. Then over the course of World War II, the country was completely obliterated. Obviously, you think of things like the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bombings of Tokyo, not nuclear bombs in that case, but just regular bombs. But anyway, the country was so obliterated because the fighting was so horrible. And so the capital stock in Japan basically went from here back down to here. I mean, that just happened as a result of the war. And the thing is, after the war ended, you know, give the country a couple years to kind of regain its footing. If you go to the late 40s, starting the late 40s to the 50s and 60s, Japan started down here after its capital stock was obliterated, and Japan started exhibiting really, really rapid growth. Because all the other stuff was still okay, right? The culture and the human capital was still geared around, you know, a healthy economy. So Japan started growing just tremendously, tremendously, and it's because of the catch-up effect. Another example is South Korea. If you look at South Korea after the Korean War, it was very, very, very poor. South Korea was one of the poorest places in the world after the Korean War. But the institutions in the country were pretty good. The country had a lot of solid positives. And when the country started adding capital, it started getting huge bang for its buck. It started really growing in productivity. And South Korea, over the course of a 50-year period, went from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in the world. Totally, totally incredible story of an economic turnaround. And you can see this happening all over the other parts of the world too. The U.S. U.S. used to grow really, really rapidly as we were accumulating capital. Now the U.S. grows much more slowly, 2 or 3% per year. This has happened to many, many, many of the rich countries. Right now in the U.S., we get very little growth as a result of capital accumulation, right? The growth that we get now comes from technological progress. We get very little growth as a result of capital accumulation. Now, I want you to pause this video and I want you to think about, what country does this most apply to today? What country is this most relevant to today? Pause this video, you figure it out because this is really important, and then come back and confirm that your answer is right, okay? All right, now we're back from the pause. China. Okay, if you go back in China, 1976 was a turning point in China. That's when Mao died. Under Mao's leadership, the economic system in China was not conducive to economic growth. We could talk about that all day, but the economic system was not conducive to growth under Mao. The country was very, very poor, but the country wasn't making any progress because the system wasn't conducive to growth. But then after Mao dies in 1976, this fellow named Deng Xiaoping, my Chinese friends have, I think, loosely confirmed that I'm pronouncing that right. But whatever. Deng Xiaoping takes over, and he starts instituting this whole turnaround in China, making the country much more market-oriented. The country still has a communist political system, and that carries with it the suppression of free speech and the suppression of the internet and blah, blah, blah. But the economic system is still different from the US or Britain or Germany, but it's much more market-oriented in general. So with the reforms that Xiaoping starts in 76, the country starts becoming much more market-oriented. Now these reforms this is a big deal, and this doesn't happen overnight. So you have to give the country about 14 years actually to really, really start seeing a difference. But then when you fast forward to about 1990, you see this start happening. You see the country now has a system that's more conducive to economic growth, and the country starts accumulating capital, and the country starts moving along the spectrum. And China starts exhibiting huge, huge, huge rates of economic growth. If you look at between 95 and 2010, you can see many years where China has exhibited 10, 12. There were even a couple of years in there where the growth was more than 12%. China was exhibiting huge, huge, huge rates of economic growth for over a decade. I mean, here in the US, we're talking about 2 or 3% economic growth. In China, they were exhibiting 10, 12% economic growth per year. Huge turnaround in that country. And it's very understandable because they started moving up this spectrum. As they started adding capital per worker, they started getting huge bangs for their bucks. But now you see that Chinese growth has slowed down. Now Chinese growth is more like 5 or 6%. Now 5 or 6% is still great for the US. It's still great for rich countries, but it's slowed down a lot from where it was. And it's so obvious. It's so understandable. I've seen people like in the news or whatever, I've seen people talk about, oh, China was growing so rapidly, but now China's only growing at 6%. Again, it's weird to say only growing at 6%, but whatever. And they act like they're so perplexed. But it's so easy to understand using the catch-up effect. It's so easy to understand. It's not hard. I mean, this is a very powerful tool. I mean, I hate to keep going on about this. I feel like I'm acting like it's Christmas morning or whatever, but this is a powerful tool in terms of explaining variation that you see across time in terms of economic growth rates. Anyway, moving on. First policy was to promote savings and investment from domestic sources. That, of course, relates to the catch-up effect. The second policy that you can advise is to promote investment from abroad. Now, we're still talking about accumulating capital in the country. We're talking about a country that has a deficit around capital, physical capital. So you can either promote policies that encourage your domestic people to save and invest, or another route would be to encourage policies that attract foreign investment. And this may be more realistic for some of the very poorest countries of the world. A country like Haiti, if you went to the president of Haiti, honestly, and if you said, hey, let's promote policies that encourage our people to save and invest, that may be laughable because the country is just so poor. Like, what do we, if our income is zero, then we can't save anything. So for a lot of countries, attracting capital from abroad may be a more realistic option in the short run. This comes in two forms. Foreign direct investment is when a foreign entity just sets up a business and runs that business. Like we go to China, we build a factory, we just run it. That's foreign direct investment. Foreign portfolio investment is when domestic people start the business and run the business, but they get their financing, they get their financial capital from foreign sources. So instead of going to China and just starting a business and just running it, some people in China would have the idea, they would run the business, they would manage the business, but they get their money to start the business from us. And then of course we receive dividends and we receive a return on that financial capital. I'm just telling you those two definitions. We're not going to talk about the distinction between the two right now. The point is, either of those options is a way to get capital into a country to get the ball rolling. Okay. Now, we'll say this is where you talk about sweatshops. Y'all have heard people talk about sweatshops that we go over to the Philippines or Indonesia and we set up a factory, and those factories are making tennis shoes for American kids, and the people there are making much, much less than what American people would make in a factory. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I mean, it's more than just that, but that's part of the discussion here. But, that's a complicated discussion. We could actually have a really rich discussion around that, but we don't have time here. I'm just telling you, this is a way to help get the ball rolling. This is a way to start some momentum rolling in a poor country, because poor countries have to find some way to get capital to get started. Third option is human capital development. You have to invest in education and training programs for your people. If your people aren't educated, they're not going to be productive workers. So it's very, very important for rich countries and poor countries alike to invest in education and training. And this also relates to health and nutrition. In the rich countries, we mostly think of it as related to education and training. But if you look at poor countries, especially kind of sub-Saharan African countries, places like that, you'll see that rates of malnutrition are up somewhere around 25, 30%. You can see very high rates of malnutrition in those countries, and that's also an impediment to, productivity as well. So in some countries, health and nutrition is part of it. I like to mention here, if you look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they put money into a lot of different areas, but this is their main focus. They've determined that this is where they're going to get the best bang on the buck for their money. So they work on health and nutrition programs for the poorest countries of the world. And I think that makes sense. I think that's actually a really high return on investment area, probably. I'm not talking about return on investment for them, right? I mean, I'm talking about return on investment, like in a charitable sense, right? That's where they're going to make the greatest difference in the world with the amount of money that they have. I think it's probably through what they've chosen to focus on. Here it's hard though. When you promote human capital development, it's hard because this is where we run into the brain drain problem. Y'all familiar with that? The brain drain problem. We have a young person in a poor country, and in the poor country, I'm just going to use my example. One of my best friends in the world kind of falls into this. One of my best friends in the world, he's a fellow who came from Sri Lanka. If you don't know where Sri Lanka is, Google it. You should know that. He came from there, and he graduated at the top of his class for undergrad in Sri Lanka. He, they've kind of identified him as a guy who has a lot of potential, a guy who can do a lot for the country. The people in Sri Lanka understand the importance of education and training and human capital development. So long story short, he is assisted in coming to the U.S. and, getting a PhD in economics and becoming a very, going back to Sri Lanka afterwards and becoming a very important part of their society and, leading the way in terms of more education and more training and more job skills and more job preparedness. So, the idea that Sri Lanka has to help him come here to get his education is consistent with what we're talking about here. He comes here. When I first met him, he was all gung-ho on the idea of going back to Sri Lanka and following along with his plan. But after he lived in the U.S. for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, he became um, way more keen on the idea of like, hey, the U.S. is pretty comfortable. There's a lot of opportunities here. I really kind of enjoy the opportunities that I have for me and my family here. I think I can really come out ahead by not going back to Sri Lanka, but by instead staying in the U.S. So there were some restrictions in place that he couldn't stay in the U.S., but the idea still applied. He ended up going to Australia. That's the brain drain problem. They take their top people and they help those top people get really good top of the line educations. And then once the top people have received those educations, they change their mind, they go somewhere else. They live somewhere else because there's higher opportunities there for people like them with their levels of education. Do you see what I'm saying here? This is bad. You go out of your way to invest in human capital. And then when that happens, you find, the top people who we've been investing in, the top people have left. And so now we're actually worse off than we were to begin with. I'm just saying promoting human capital development is vital to long-run economic prosperity, but it's really hard to do. And one of the reasons for that is the brain drain problem, because many times the investment can backfire when you find that the result is that your top people leave. It's insane, but that's part of the problems that we face in the world, at least for poor countries. West Virginia actually faces that to some extent. West Virginia faces the brain drain problem to other U.S. states, so it's not isolated to just international scale. The next one is property rights and political stability. I would strongly, strongly encourage you to read the book, at least on this topic. This is the most important one. I imagine this economic development pyramid, because all of these aren't the same. Some are more important than others, okay? They're all important, but some are more important than others. And this is the most important one. You can imagine this economic development pyramid, and promoting property rights is the foundation of the economic development pyramid, because nothing else will work without this. So property rights is kind of a vague term, and I'm not for sure that everybody understands kind of what that means outside of economics. Economists, when they say property rights, they know exactly what they're talking about. But the term itself is not that clear. What this means is that people have strong, secure, stable rights to their property. If I have property, if I invest, I have no fear of somebody else stealing that. Property rights subsumes the notion of a fair legal system. Right? In some countries, like you could imagine a scenario in some parts of the world or wherever, where we have a property dispute, and I'm a member of the kind of favored ethnic group or whatever, or I'm male, you're female, I'm in the favored ethnic group, you're in the disfavored ethnic group. We go to court to settle this property dispute, and the judge doesn't decide based on the merits of the case. Instead, the judge decides based on, this person's in the favored group, that person's in the unfavored group, we're just going to choose that person. That's bad. That's bad. And when you have a legal system that isn't fair and upfront and honest and transparent and unbiased, then that can prevent investment in the country. Right? If people aren't confident that they're going to receive the property that they are owed, if they invest, they start a business, if they're entrepreneurial, then that investment's not going to happen. Right? Having secure, stable, fair property rights, having an unbiased legal system that judges people just on the merits of the case, not on any personal matters, all that is vital to promoting investment. All that is vital to promoting long-run economic prosperity. We could talk about this all day. There have been big, very significant books written on this topic. You can look back at economic history and you can see that the countries that were able to develop stronger legal systems, more just legal systems. I mean, again, none of the systems have been perfectly just or perfect in any way, but we're talking about relative speaking. But if you look back at the countries that have developed the stronger legal systems that are stronger at protecting property and operating in a fair and just way, you can see that those countries have done better than countries where there's bias and where there's favoritism and where the government just seizes property, for example. Strong, fair protection of property rights, legitimate system, that's important. I mean, for example, here's another example. So my ex-wife, one time she went to Russia on vacation. I don't know why she went to Russia. It's not my top vacation destination. If I was going on vacation, I would think of Spain or Rome or something. But anyway, she went to Russia. And at the border, she was going into Russia at St. Petersburg. She was coming in from Finland. And they said, oh, your passport's not right. You know, you're not going to be able to come in. Your passport's not right. It's not going to work. And she gives the guy a $20 bill, and all of a sudden her passport's fine. That happens all the time in many countries of the world, right? Bribery is a normal part of everyday business in many parts of the world. That's a perfect example of the opposite of what we're talking about here. Right? You wouldn't think of doing that in the US. You wouldn't think of bribing somebody at the DMV to get your driver's license. It'd be unthinkable. But that's very common in many parts of the world, and that's the counterexample. That's the opposite of what we're talking about when we're talking about property rights and political stability. And also, well, we say property rights, but political stability relates to this because if you have unrest, if you have like a civil war, then that just brings into question the property rights, right? If a civil war or some type of coup or some type of uprising happens that might threaten the government or might threaten the legal system, then that just creates risk over property rights. The last three, promote free trade. It's generally the case that outwardly oriented economies that are open to free trade are better off. We talked back in one of the earlier chapters about how free trade benefits the country, about how free trade promotes economic growth overall. It's the case that outwardly oriented economies that are open to free trade grow more over the long run than those countries that are worried about protecting domestic industry from foreign competition. There's always a temptation, there's always some pressure, there's always some reason to promote protectionist policies, which we talked about back in the earlier chapter. But when countries succumb to those temptations, it reduces economic development over the long run. Next one, promote research and development. That's how you get new technology, right? I mean, for the government to have a legal system in place that encourages research and development, that goes back to property rights. But for the legal system to be, protective of new ideas, new inventions, that's important. And for the government even just to subsidize and support research and development, that's an important part of promoting technological progress, which promotes productivity and long-run economic growth. And then the last one is population control. Sometimes population growth helps boost GDP per capita. That's, this is not a universal thing. Sometimes population growth helps the situation. But in other cases, more and more people can just kind of erode the capital stock per person and make GDP per person less with higher population growth. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at the richest countries in the world, they have slower population growth rates. They have fewer births per woman. If you look at England, the family in England had 2 kids. On the flip side, you find that the poor countries of the world have more births per woman, and in a lot of cases, that population growth tends to erode the capital stock, preventing the countries from, getting wealthier on a per person basis in the long run. If you look at the family from Mali in that picture that we looked at the beginning of the lecture, that family from Mali had like 7 kids, eating away at the capital stock that they were able to accumulate. All right, that's the discussion. If we had more time, we could do so much more with this because, like I said, this is the most important chapter of the course. And anyway, hopefully we can have some discussion in the Zoom session and kind of flesh this out a little bit more. Anyway, thank you all so much. See you back with the savings and investment chapter.